Our focus today is on the connections between percents and proportions. This is, of course, going to be very similar to the relationship between percents and fractions that we were working on before. However, our objectives are a little bit different. We're focusing entirely on solving problems using the percent proportion. And for word problems, that means knowing how to set up and create the proportion. And I've also got a mnemonic that will allow us to more easily figure out percent of a number or number for a percent. A lot of percent problems can be solved using a proportion like this. Keeping in mind that when we were working with rates and solving, we focused really heavily on having matching labels. Anytime you're creating a proportion, it's based on matching labels. And so the percent proportion is based on the so-called labels of having the part in the numerator for both of them. It's just that we're going to represent the part in two different ways. We can represent part of something as a number part, or we can represent it as a percent part. Same thing with the whole amount. We would have the whole amount represented as a number in the denominator, and the whole amount represented as a percent. But since one whole is always 100%, realistically, we're just going to rewrite this thing as 100% and just say, go with that. This piece down here is our percent proportion. It is a guide to help you figure out where to put things inside a proportion when you're working with word problems. To help make this even easier than that, we can take the percent proportion and use this mnemonic to help us out with a specific type of problem. Is and of are words that frequently get tied with the number part and the whole number part. Is over of equals percent over 100. And as you're working through these, you may want to write both of these things down for your notes, because these are the things that we are going to use on setting up the proportions. All right, so here's what we're working with. What percent of 7 is 4? Well, the percent proportion has this handy mnemonic, is over of equals the percent over 100. When you read through these pieces, we can identify what percent of 7 is 4. And so these are pieces that we would put in. We would have 4 goes to is, 7 goes for of, and what percent, the word what is guiding us towards the variable. We've got it set up. And so we just have to cross multiply, solve this proportion then. 7 times p, 4 times 100, divide out by 7, and I'm going to choose to keep this in a fraction form. 400 divided by 7 equals how much? Okay, setting up some long division. 400 divided by 7 goes in 5 times to give us 35. 7 will go into 57 times, leaving a remainder of 1. So we would have 57 and 1/7%. Of course, we know that 1/7 or 400 divided by 7 is something that we can stick into our calculator. It's going to give us a decimal, 0.1428, blah, 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 keep going, and we could round it. Or we could set up the division and get an exact answer. Unless the directions tell you to round, we prefer exact answers. Okay, going to this problem on the right, and we'll switch colors. Same type. What percent of 72 is 54? That sets us up with is over of equals percent over 100. And we can solve this any way we would like. being big nerd here, one of the things that I'm noticing, I could actually simplify my ratio on the left by dividing by 18. I recognize that's 3/4, and that's much simpler to solve. Of course, if you choose to cross multiply to solve, that's perfectly valid as well. It's just this is the technique I saw, so it's the one I chose to go with. And I like this one because now I can set up the equivalent ratios with multiplying by 25, giving me my answer that we've got 75%. 75% of 72 is 54. Okay, I paused the video there for a second to answer some of the questions that people had, and now I'm going to, for the sake of having it in the video, try to clear it up a little bit. When we were looking back at the original, 54 over 72 equals p over 100. If you wanted to, you absolutely could have cross-multiplied to get 72p, 54 times 100. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's completely correct. If you prefer cross-multiplying, go ahead and do it that way. This is a piece that I can't look at 5400 and divide by 72 in my head. And I don't like using calculators. It's just the way my brain is wired. I'd rather do it differently. Even though I recognize the stuff in the red is completely correct, I don't want to do it that way. If you do, go ahead. There's nothing wrong with it. I looked at the fraction 54 over 72, and when I looked at it, being a nerd, I've got my multiples of 18 memorized, and so I recognized that I could simplify it down to 3/4. At that stage, I then had to look at it and say, I need to turn 4 into 100. In order to turn 4 into 100, I have to multiply by 25. Since I'm multiplying by 25 in my denominator, I need to multiply by 25 in the numerator also. And so 3 times 25, that's 75, and that's what gave me my p. I preferred the method in blue because that's what clicks with my brain. You don't have to think the way I do. And so if you've got a different way of solving it, as long as it's valid, go ahead, that's fine. Okay, changing the gears a little bit. You'll notice the problems we were looking at here were what percent of 7 is 4. Well, we can phrase these types of problems a little bit differently. And the next type we will examine, we're still able to use the percent proportion, is over of equals percent over 100. What number is 24% of 200? And of course, the percent symbol has got to be tied to the number itself. Well, this tells us then what number is 24% of 200. We can build our proportion, and of course we know how to solve these. Like before, you can choose to multiply, you can choose to divide, you can cross multiply. This is one that I choose to use equivalent ratios, because what I'm looking at, in order to go this direction, to turn 100 into 200, I'd have to multiply by 2. So doing the exact same thing in my numerator, 24 times 2 would give me n. I've got my answer. It's 48. 48 is 24% of 200.
So it's just like the other one, just
And we're done.
backwards.
Yes. In terms of the structure, because we're setting up a proportion, it's just the only thing that's different is how we set it up. Okay, looking over at the one on the right. What number is 40% of 80? Okay, so we would say, what number is 40% of 80. And this is another one that you see how we had to have 40 over 100. My preference would be to simplify 40 over 100 just because I want smaller numbers. But we don't always have to do things the way that I like them. We can cross multiply. There's nothing wrong with that. So 100 times m, 100m, 80 times 40, 8 times 4 is 32. Put on our two zeros for 80 and 40.
32.
Divide out by 100,
It's 32.
and we've got 32. 32 is 40% of 80. And there we're finished. It's been my experience that a lot of students really appreciate this mnemonic, is over of equals percent over 100, because it makes it relatively easy to identify where the pieces go. Don't rely on this completely as a crutch, because the percent proportion does allow us to solve other problems besides the ones that are like this. Especially when you start looking at a word problem, word problems are not geared as what percent of 12 is 16. They're not written that way. Now, if you can read through the problem and rewrite the problem to recognize that format, that's a valid strategy. You can do it that way. For this particular problem, we're saying in a heptathlon, athletes earn points based on 7 different events. Well, let's suppose that an athlete earns 836 points in the 100-meter hurdles, which makes up 16% of the overall score. What is his or her total score? Well, when you read this, are you able to recognize that kind of structure? Okay, if you can, go ahead and rewrite it that way. This is a piece, well, some of the things that I'm looking at, 16%. Okay, I'd look at that and say, what something is 16% of? Okay, so what number is 836 of 836? And so a lot of times students will look at it and say, oh, here we go, we'll put this in. And this is where you've got to be careful, because it's not always just perfect. When we're looking at this, I have not yet said that this stuff written in black is correct. We put down things that students will often try out. But keep in mind, when we're writing out the is over of equals percent over 100, this was a mnemonic that was designed to, in a certain context, make it easier to recognize the is your number part. Of referred to the whole amount expressed in its numeric form. Percent was the part expressed, and whole percent, of course, is 100. This piece over here on the right is actually the percent proportion. You should know how to use this, and it is, I think, easier for word problems, because when you look at it, we clearly have two different things. We have 16% and we have 836 points. Instead of trying to figure out what number is, and trying to translate it to English, I think it's easier to simply say know the proportion and then put them where they belong. 16%, of course, is going to be our 16% section. 836 then. Is 836 part of a score, or was it the total score? It was only part. It was the part that they got from the 100-meter hurdles. Recognizing that 836 is a number form for part of their score, it leads us to saying we're looking for their total score. And if we tried to do the piece where we were just fitting it in, you notice that of 836, we actually would have built it incorrectly. by putting down of 136. By trying to translate it here originally, translating it in its format is somewhat difficult. A lot of students struggle with it, and they would have wound up creating something that was not valid. That's why you should know the percent proportion outside of the mnemonic. You should know that it is based on number part and number whole. That way you can build proportions like these and actually solve the problem appropriately. So now that we've got the correct format, let's actually go through and answer the question. How do you want to solve it? Okay, cross multiply, so we'll take 16 times t, 836 times 100, and then of course we have to divide by 16 to solve it, so 83,600 divided by 16, 5,225. Charlie helped us out with calculator.
Yeah.
So there we go. The heptathlon athlete's total score was 5,225 points.
So, yeah, you're good.
Well, I guess, did they do well? I guess it depends on what did everyone else have. If somebody else had like 12,000 points, then yeah, he didn't do too well. But if everybody else was only like 4,800 or 3,000, then yeah, he won. So I guess it depends on other people's scores as well. But we'll notice, of course, whether you choose to use the percent proportion written out in its general format, or you choose to use the mnemonic format, the key characteristic is understanding how to set up a proportion appropriately. You've already demonstrated that you have this skill of solving. We need to focus on setting it up so that we actually can take advantage of your skills to get our answers that we're looking for.